Welcome, everyone, to our September webinar at the Global Environmental Law Center. We have moved our webinars to be bi-monthly, and we are really excited to host Chad Patrick Osorio today, who is speaking on a topic I find incredibly interesting and a topic that is growing in prominence and importance when we speak about climate change or environmental governance. And I'm really happy to host Chad. He is going to speak to us today on cultural heritage law versus illicit wildlife markets and thinking about a new regulatory path for Southeast Asia. Chad is a PhD researcher at Wageningen University, specializing in environmental economics and law. He is adjunct assistant professor in the School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of Philippines, Los Banos. Chad's transdisciplinary research bridges law, economics, and emerging technologies such as AI, with a focus on governance of complex social environmental systems. For his work on wildlife trade, Chad received the 2023 Amartya Sen Prize, top 2, from the Yale Global Justice Program. And he has published on sustainable art law and wildlife protection in a joint issue of the Harvard Art Law Review and the Harvard International Law Journal. This paper in progress has been invited to be workshopped at the Global Scholars Academy of the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School. And I have also had the privilege of hearing Chad speak on this topic, so I'm really excited to see some of my students and colleagues here today. Chad, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us, and I'm really looking forward to your presentation. We'll have you present first, and questions will be held at the end.
Okay, thank you so much, Angela. Can everyone hear me? Yes, can you please give a thumbs up if you can hear me? Amazing, thank you. All right, so let me just share my screen. Yes. All right. So today we're going to talk about cultural heritage law versus illicit wildlife markets. So I will take maybe 40 minutes of everyone's precious time to discuss something which is also very close to my heart. It is a topic of my PhD. It's something I've been working on for a couple of years now, and particularly focused in Southeast Asia, which is where I'm from. I'm from the Philippines originally, but I want to expand my analysis not only to my country, but also to neighboring countries, especially because of porous borders. So before I introduce the things I'm working on, I would also like to ask our people today your name, your country, and what is your favorite wildlife? Can you put it in the chat below? Your name, your country, and what is your favorite wildlife? It would be great so that I also have an idea of what people like and also who they are and where they're from. Yes? Okay. Are people typing?
I think they are.
Yes. Okay. Yes, of course. Yay. Okay. Crocodiles. This is Princess Pimi. She's also a very dear friend and colleague of mine from the Philippines. Peter, all wildlife. Okay. Yes. Uh, yes. Okay. So we're going to refer to a cheetah, zebra. Okay. We're going to refer to all of your answers later on in a bit. But it's super, super nice that we have at least an idea of what kind of wildlife we are. And maybe later on, we can get to the bottom of why wildlife appeals to us and why this is important when we talk about cultural law. Yes, we have lions, we have elephants. Okay. So as a bit of an introduction about myself, I work in criminal justice as a lawyer. And then afterwards, I did my master's degree in business economics. But then I've also been passionate ever since about environmental protection. And the combination of these three fields from where I'm from has gone all to natural resources crimes, financial crimes, and natural resources management, which comes down to illegal wildlife crime. And it's so opportune that the University of Western Cape, the global Environmental Law Center is hosting us today because South Africa is also quite well known for its reserves and all the efforts that is doing to prevent illegal wildlife crime. I am advised by three amazing people, environmental economists and lawyers, Dr. Andres Richter, Dr. Nadia Bernaz, and Dr. Anna Abatayo. And so far, I've been working on a number of different things when it comes to my PhD. So some of the things I've been working on are, for example, exploring risk-based legal strategies in transnational environmental harms in the ASEAN. It's something I work on with my colleague Francesca. And of course, a paper that we're working on with my advisors, unintended consequences of wildlife trade bans. I've submitted the draft yesterday, so I have my fingers crossed that my advisors and co-authors, we can submit it very soon. But more than that, as Angela mentioned also, I do a number of, I've published in a number of different publications, different journals on the subject. So I talk about a human rights approach to addressing illegal wildlife trade. I talk about art law and transnational environmental harms, and of course, regulatory finance. So it's a combination of my economics background, my law background, and of course also my human rights centered, also environmental rights centered advocacy. So the reason why I'm explaining to you my background is because I want to share my positionality with you. This means that this is where I'm approaching this topic. And so all my ideas are informed by by these particular perspectives. So economics, psychology, and law. And of course, now we're going to talk about cultural heritage law versus illicit wildlife trade, a regulatory path or a new regulatory path for Southeast Asia. Okie dokie. So, in the remaining um, 35 or so minutes, I will talk about four things. Well, first, let's talk about the illegal wildlife trade. What is IWT and why are policy interventions against it important? Number two, existing interventions. What is the government and international organizations and individuals doing so far against it? Number three, let's talk about cultural heritage law. What is it? Or rather, what are they? And how can they support the prevention of IWT? And of course, moving forward, where am I in my current research? Like, Chad, are you really still writing this paper? And yes, I am. We're still working on it. We're still developing it. And hopefully, at the end of this discussion, I would only not get questions, but I also want your insights, your feedback, your positionalities and perspective on this, recognizing everyone in this room as an expert in their own respective fields. Are you guys ready? Yes, I presume so.
Yes.
Yes. All right, thank you. Now, let's talk about the illegal wildlife trade. Why the heck is it so important? Well, IWT, when we talk about wildlife, is that it means all flora and fauna. So it's not just necessarily animals, but it's also plants. It When you say wildlife trade, includes all sales or exchanges of wild animal and plant resources by people. So that means that even if you do it for money or if you just exchange it, it should be fine. It is covered by wildlife trade. So a lot of wildlife trade is legal, meaning you can, excuse me, go to the market and buy wildlife, meaning things which have grown from not from farms, and that's okay. But then it becomes illegal wildlife because of a number of conditions. But regardless of whether it's legal or illegal, it is one of the most profitable businesses in the world because it covers food, it covers medicine, it covers luxury goods, etc., etc. So it becomes a crime when acts are taken in contravention of national laws and regulations. Meaning, for example, if South Africa bans the sale of cheetah bones, then that means that if you sell cheetah bones, that automatically becomes a crime. Or international regulations. CITES is an international convention, supported, of course, by the organization of multiple initiatives against illegal wildlife trade. And so it seeks to limit the amount of um, wildlife trade, which is happening all around the world. So even though it's allowed, once you exceed that limit, then it becomes a crime. It's one of the most profitable illicit activities in the world. It is actually the fourth largest illicit activity next to drug trafficking, human trafficking, and weapon smuggling. So its estimated annual value ranges from 19 billion to 23 billion. That's a huge amount. But also, I'd like to highlight that we should take these figures into with a grain of salt, precisely because, again, illegal markets are quite difficult to assess. Now, why is it so important? Um, After all, not a lot of people have tigers at home as pets, right? So, unless someone here is royalty or incredibly rich. Why would it affect an ordinary citizen like me? I am an activist, I am an author, I am an economist, I am a lawyer. But then IWT threats to biodiversity are there's a lot. So there's 950 plus species of different plants and animals are at risk because of international demand. 65.8% of species reduce species abundance, and 33% of all birds and mammals worldwide are threatened because of illegal wildlife trade, amongst other factors. So it has a number of implications. So aside from biodiversity harming the environment, it has a cascading effect on ecosystem services. So that means humans are affected. When you talk about bees, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and then it also impacts industries like local tourism. Think sanctuaries, reservations, and also the life sciences. A huge part of pharmaceutical companies get get their chemical compounds from plants and animals. So if we destroy them, if their species numbers goes down, then it's going to be a big blow for industries like tourism, life sciences, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, you name it, it will likely be directly or indirectly affected. We know this also. It increases the risk of zoonotic diseases and the rise of epidemics. COVID, and also facilitates invasive species taking over. When we trade wildlife and we bring them to another country, there's a risk that they can escape and that they can populate the local ecosystem. So that harms the local ecosystem aside from the ecosystem where they came from. It's also not a standalone crime. It's connected to other illicit activities. So, for example, the trade routes that are used in wildlife trafficking are also the same trade routes that are used in human trafficking or drug smuggling. Also, at the same time, the money that is being earned through IWT helps finance other crimes and also political and military insurgencies. And it's not just about um, everyone in the world affected equally. There are victims more than there are people who gain from illegal wildlife trade. So, for example, developing countries who are also normally rich in natural resources, they lose potential fiscal revenues from natural capital, undermine reduction efforts when it comes to poverty, because a lot of the communities living in these areas are also the ones being victimized. So we have a paper on that with Nadia and I quite some time ago on a lot of the implications, human rights, from economic to social to political. Everything is connected, recognizing the fact that wildlife is a part of the environment and humans are a part of the environment, and we are all in one big system. And if you damage one, then you can damage another. What this then the reason why we should alleviate IWT, illegal wildlife trade. Well, if we prevent the harms of illegal wildlife trade, we can do a number of things. We can improve biodiversity. It results to communities and industries benefiting. We can assist the development of non-urban localities. So we're not saying that wildlife trade is bad per se, but going beyond the limits, for example, set by law, or going for endangered species, which are, for example, ecosystem engineers, can really, really harm the economic development, especially of rural areas and forested areas. So this is why if we prevent the illegal wildlife trade, we can assist the economic development of non-urban localities. It cuts off an important funding source of organized crime, which a number of people I know in this room are experts on, and reduce the risk of zoonotic diseases, and lastly, help level the inequality between developed and developing countries. And so, as I highlighted a while ago, I do my research on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So, Association of Southeast Asian Nations is also known as ASEAN. They're a member of 10 countries with two observer countries, Papua New Guinea and East Timor. And this is the area where I show on the map. And as you see, we have different land and maritime borders, which are porous. So, meaning from the tip of the Philippines, you go to another country literally without needing your passport. And it's so easy to just go by boat, for example. So it's very porous. So it's so easy to smuggle a lot of different things which might not normally be allowed through customs. So it's very important to look at that also because ASEAN is the fifth largest economy in the world. And it's very important to look at it as a growing region. So if it's all important, um, if it's harmful to biodiversity, Chad, if it's harmful to the local economies, if it's harmful to human rights, what are the existing interventions against it? Surely people are doing something against it. And I would say you are totally right. There are a number of interventions against it. So, for example, one is, and again, going back to basic economics, supply and demand, there are complete bans on the supply side. They are protected areas, so marine protected areas, for example, which prohibit the harvesting of marine creatures, primarily fish, but also other sea creatures. We also have reserves, for example, or otherwise you have sustainable harvesting. So instead of saying, okay, let's ban it absolutely, let's go for maybe raising them and sustainably harvest them, farming legal substitute, for example. um so finding another animal or plant which has the same benefits as the original endangered species one, and of course alternative livelihood projects so that they can explore other things, especially for people living in poverty who are engaged into in these kinds of activities willingly or unwillingly. On the demand side, meaning the people buying it, and because it's international trade, it's normally in another country. Of course, there's complete bans in their market. Of course, also promoting substitutes and information campaigns. So there's a lot of different methods by which we try to prevent illegal wildlife trade. This is not the exhaustive list, but these are like the most general ones that are often common in the world. The supply chain goes like this. So there's the legal harvesting. This is the legal one, right? Legal, and then you have either breeding collections, meaning that they get it for captive breeding, and then they have the local or retail sale, meaning that like they just let it go right after harvesting. They transport, wholesale traders, and then retail trade. And then you have, on the other hand, the illegal wildlife trade. You have poaching networks. Normally these are because so it's all as huge group, again part of organized crime. You normally have runners or brokers, and then the intermediaries or the dealers. And then, of course, you have to export them, and then, of course, import them, and then goes to intermediaries, and then it goes to the black market. So these are the normal process by which the supply chain in wildlife trade works, both illegal and illegal. And there are a number of laws and enforcement bodies which seek to prevent this. So, first of all, as I mentioned a while ago, is CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, supported by the UN Convention on Transnational Crime. I have an upcoming fingers crossed paper about it. The UN Convention Against Corruption, recognizing that corruption plays an important role in how these plants and animals are shipped from one country to another. Of course, there are regional agreements criminalizing transnational harm. So, for example, the ASEAN WIN, meaning the ASEAN Wildlife Enforcement Network. You have the South African WIN. You have, meaning all those countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You have a number of different ones. And of course, domestic wildlife protection laws. Um, and that means we have a lot of laws. That sounds great, right? Like, okay, Chad, you say we have a problem. There's the solution. There's a lot of things from the international to the national to the regional. And in some cases, there's also local, meaning community level. There are laws which are passed to prevent harvesting of wildlife. So, what's the problem? Well, what do you notice with these ones? with these uh with these interventions, well, they focus on two themes: trade trade suppression and criminalization. And what do you notice about it? Anyone? Yes. So what we notice about it is that, sorry, I closed my screen. What is noticeable about it is that they normally focus on a lot of it, and you also saw in the graph, a lot of it is focused on the supply side. Um, and this is challenging, uh, because again, as I highlighted a while ago, it's not a one-time thing. Meaning that you address the supply side, you solve everything. As long as the demand keeps popping up, then there's already challenges when it comes to addressing the equation. So it's going to be imbalanced. Um, Again, number of things which are problematic: over reliance on deterrence, low perceived cost of crime. It doesn't matter. Inelastic demand makes price-focused bans ineffective, meaning that at the end of the day, people will always, if people really want it, regardless of how much it is, they will find a way to pay it. Institutional fragmentation and corruption, meaning different groups of institutions plus corruption hinder coordination and enforcement. Um, People are forced to work for poachers because they don't have alternatives for rural communities. They don't have incentives. And legal instruments often miss the underlying economic and cultural dynamics. Again, as I mentioned a while ago, um, it's all about trade suppression and criminalization, not necessarily about other potential aspects, uh, which are equally important when we talk about wildlife trade. It's even more complicated because a while ago I mentioned the tak, 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 the legal and illegal wildlife trade, but there's also the issue of laundering, because sometimes poaching networks, they also go to local retail sites, and then they do transport, and then they do wholesale trade. So again, even within the legal and illegal wildlife trade supply, it becomes a challenge now. So what do we do about this? Like, what can we do? We've had a number of laws. How can we support these without necessarily having to reinvent the wheel, without necessarily having to show everything, which is sorry, without necessarily having to show or create new laws specifically for this. We don't have to revamp the system in order to make things work. And this is nope, 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 nope. This is where this comes in. Cultural heritage law. And basically the question now is uh the question now is going for the demand side. So a while ago, they focused a lot criminalization and trade suppression. And even in the list, there are more supply side options in the law. But then what about the demand side options? Like people buy or not buy wildlife products. And what can we do about it? How can we actually design laws and policies so that it targets them from the beginning to not want to buy wildlife products? Is there even a way to do that? And this is what I'm working on. There are a number of drivers of demand for wildlife products. So, for example, you have cultural, you have medicinal, you have social economic. There's a number of others based on the literature, but these are more or less quite the common ones. So the fact that you want to show off and like, hey, I can afford this. The fact that you want to use it ancient medicines and cultural meaning having to have all of these art products as well. And there's also um of these factors. So this is why my research work, I'm proposing cultural heritage law. Cultural heritage target the very idea of why we want this. Why do we even want to have a tiger as a freaking pet? Why do we want to have the rare monstera plant, which is endangered in some parts of the world, to have in our house? Why do we even have to have it in our house? Um, and if we want it so bad, normally people will really do things to get them, even if it's illegal. And this is why using cultural heritage law can maybe help in reducing that want, that goal have it. And so, cultural heritage law is a branch of international and domestic law that governs the protection, management, and preservation of cultural heritage. So, that means both tangible and intangible forms. So, meaning knowledge, when we talk about intangible, but also tangible, like actual things. And then it intersects with such fields as human rights, environmental law, and indigenous rights. So, UNESCO, for example, they have a number of protected areas, which are both culturally significant but also environmentally significant as well. In the paper draft right now, which I have the proportion of the number of culturally protected areas versus the number of environmentally protected UNESCO heritage sites versus both. So I think it's a good way to show also how these are different. Um, and key principles of cultural heritage law are the following. Well, it's all about preservation, safeguarding heritage for future generation. Second is respect for cultural diversity. Third is non-commercialization. And fourth is community involvement. Why are these all important? Um, first, First, well, preservation is also similar to the goal of sustainability of environmental law. Non-commercialization, um, quite similar. Community involvement, respect for cultural diversity as well, meaning that when we pass environmental laws, when we pass beliefs, for example, when we pass policies, beliefs and cultural tradition should be taken into account. Not that they should matter in the general scheme of things, meaning that environmental protection, and this is my own perception, should trump thousands of years of cultural practice. But at the end of the day, all of these key principles of cultural heritage law are also the same or very similar with principles of international environmental law. And cultural heritage law, because of this, can help reframe wildlife protection as a cultural duty, not just an environmental one. Um, Meaning that when we have cultural heritage law, if we ingrain in people, especially children, hey, I am from this nationality, I have a very rich culture, and our culture is proud that we are the stalwarts of the environment, that we are guardians of the chimpanzees, we are the guardians of the forests. It can help reframe wildlife protection as a cultural identity. And it's not just, hey, I'm an environmentalist, but rather, in addition to that, I, as a person, part of a group, is a protector of wildlife. And as we know, group dynamics and in group sentiments are very, very strong. It can also promote self-regulation and normative change within communities, reducing enforcement burden. This is very important because enforcement burdens are very high. This is the reason why to um it's so difficult to address wildlife trade, wildlife poaching, precisely because you cannot have a police person following every single individual around in the forest. They have to be concentrated. Um, they have to be concentrated within a specific area. So that's why they're normally in markets and customs and everything because they cannot follow it around. But what if we have a system wherein they are wherein the communities police each other. It promotes self-regulation and normative change. And if we actually imbibe this in cultural heritage law, if we actually have laws which help engender in people the protection of culture and the natural environment as part of their cultural heritage, then it can promote self-regulation and normative change. Of course, it's only not about the legal systems that we know and the scientific systems that we know. It's also important to listen to the people who are actually living in these environments. They have been living there for thousands of years, and listening to them, bridging what they know with what we know, and finding a common ground can help. Um, this. So, for example, um, banning hunting per se, when in fact tribes have been hunting for hundreds of years beforehand, and it's necessary to keep populations in check, um, might be short-sighted. Rather, working with these people, making sure that um, any and all developments regarding these natural reservations, these protected areas, are in line with not only environmental standards, but also cultural heritage, can actually make these things more successful. At the end of the day, what do we want basically? Well, from the demand side, it can influence consumer behavior without imposing Western centric bans, um, and redefines prestige and status through sustainable cultural practice. What does this mean basically? Consumer behavior, meaning that, for example, been um I have been consuming rhino horn to increase my potency. And people say, "Oh, I don't believe you," or this is a Western banning them is like is a Western centric. But if you approach it from a cultural perspective, meaning that we fund initiatives, for example, wherein we have instead of uh scientists speaking to these communities, but we have cultural ambassadors, people who know, who can bridge both the cultural aspect of it, with the legal aspect of it, then we can actually maybe see a change in their behavior because they're listening to someone not from an outside perspective, but from an inside perspective. But of course, which law as a funding structure, as an institutional support, as a way to build these behaviors uh, can influence consumer behavior. The same works for stigmas. Stigmatizing harmful environmental practices, particularly wildlife practices, can actually redefine prestige or status through sustainable cultural practice. So it helps campaign certification systems. We can combine basically uh, environmental protection with natural heritage protection. And I think this is great because at the end of the day, it's also more efficient because for the same amount of time and effort that we put in going one or the other, we can probably design workshops, seminars, information campaigns, which take into account all of this. So at the end of the day, it's a more efficient solution to a challenge which harms a lot of people. And then from the supply side, again, reduce enforcement costs and norms embedded in spiritual or identity-based practices can support conservation. So all of these are quite important when we talk about this, and some of the examples are below. So, question now, is it feasible? Of course, like Chad, maybe you're just like shooting air out of you, right? So this is also what I wanted to ask myself. And both as a lawyer and also an applied economist, in my head, I want to design an experiment, probably a field experiment, which can help measure whether these are which can help measure whether cultural heritage laws properly placed within communities can actually support uh, less consumer and producer behavior when it comes to consuming wildlife. This is also supported by one of my master students. So I'm advising her, and her work is on cultural wildlife law. Um, and how it can help in the context of the Philippines. So this is also interesting, and maybe the next time we can also invite her to talk about her research. And so it complements my work. And also in the future, we're probably going to do an economic experiment, a field experiment, wherein we interview people. We and then we see how a situation where they were introduced to a cultural law policy, cultural heritage law uh, can actually influence the choices that they make. So at the end of the day, and this is us wrapping up, IAAT has persisted despite decades of interventions and despite decades of legal action. Now, what can we do? Cultural heritage law, aside from focusing on just supply side deterrence, can offer a complementary value by reshaping norms and serving not only the supply side, as I mentioned a while ago, but also the demand side. So it addresses both of them in a more specific and focused way. And of course, this paper emphasizes the role of ASEAN, proposing culturally grounded conservation strategies. So in my paper, I will give examples, as I did a while ago, about snow leopards and Vietnamese medicinal rhino horn, in how we can actually have culturally grounded conservation strategies which are focused on human behavior in the general scheme of things. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening to this discussion. And if you have any questions, comments, suggestions, violent reactions, the floor is open. And you can reach me through my email address or my website here or on LinkedIn. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chad. That was very insightful. Also, really insightful to think about um, how cultural context should really be used to inform legal approaches. I do have a question for you, but before I hog the webinar with my question, let's see if there are any questions from the audience. Anyone is welcome to raise their hand or to post the question in the chat. Anyone?
In my classes, also, whenever people don't have questions, I joke that maybe me, it's time to ask questions. So are you guys ready for the quiz? No, I'm joking, of course. Yeah, it also doesn't necessarily have to be questions. Also sharing your own thoughts on the matter. Because I know some people, for example, Zunaida or Mimi Amparo, they work on different fields, but also related
Hmm,
fields. So sharing your ideas, um, would really, really help.
definitely. I also encourage Zunadia and others to do that. Maybe I'll
Yes,
start.
please. Yes.
So, given your strong approach on sort of the community and indigenous context for helping enforce wildlife law, I
Hmm.
was wondering to what extent is there a scope for wildlife trade and wildlife law drawing from rights of nature and earth jurisprudence? And have you started to look at that in your own research? And do you think there is a case to be made, or is the argument that we cannot change people's cultures and uses of animals? And I'm thinking of captive breeding, for instance, or even the desire to have a tiger as a pet. Do
Right.
you think there is a role for rights of nature and earth jurisprudence?
Yes. Thank you, Angela. That's really, really such an important question. And I think the answer would be yes. The reason why I also push on cultural drivers of wildlife trade, both on the demand and the supply side, is because I really think that this could be changed. Already around the world, we have growing movements on rights of nature, um, uh, bodies of water being recognized, for example, the living tree, for example, being recognized. We also have on another level, Earth systems law, perspectives wherein taking everything into account. I think, and this is precisely the reason why I'm supporting cultural law as an avenue for this, because information can actually change people. But more than just information, emotion can actually change people. And cultural law, I believe, can help address both fronts. So it's not just about, okay, information campaign, leave them with something. But then at the end of the day, and this is a paper I'm currently writing on, it can backfire. So you see, oh, don't eat lion meat. And then people are like, what? You can eat lion meat? Oh my gosh, now I want to try it. So it can backfire. But rather framing it in a way which is responsible and helpful, and taking into the cultural context into account, saying, hey, you are a protector of this environment. Why would you do that? So for sure, Angela, I think in the longer term, it would be good to connect this research with other fields like and other topics of research like rights of nature and how do you say this, and in earth system law. But at present, in my present research, I think I'm more focused on the more practical aspect, like really the economics of it, like tack, 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 let's do this, let's do that. And then maybe a better philosopher than me could tackle this problem from these perspectives.
Thanks, Chad. Yeah, it's just encouraging from me. If I think about the rights of nature movement, a lot of it is driven by communities.
Mm,
And so there is that bottom up approach. So I think that maybe in this context, an approach like that could be useful. I see Peter has a question, so I'm going to give Peter an opportunity and then we'll move to Zunadia. So we'll take two questions and then you can maybe answer those two and we'll see if there are more.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks, Chad, for a very, very interesting talk. Um, I'm still quite surprised, though, in terms of, and perhaps this has a very strong ASEAN focus, because the reality is that a lot of our wildlife crime from the South African thing, especially illegal wildlife trade. So a classic example is, for example, rhino, is not selling to local
Yeah.
users of rhino. And so if you're looking at a sort of a cultural law applying to South African cultural law, you're basically once again looking at supply side, not the demand side. South Africans understanding the importance of rhino on its cultural value and what have you is not going to change the demand from Southeast Asia on rhino horn at all. So it seems that to me that you're still looking at the supply side. And in terms of local demand, I mean, the experience that I've had around, for example, trade in things like iconic species, the awful South African lion bone trade, for example, and the awful trade in leopard skins. There's already strong cultural elements to these sort of things as well. I mean, during the high-level panel on elephants, rhino, lion, and leopard, the panel spoke to Contralesa, to basically traditional leaders around the use of about sort of things like lion bone breeding and these sort of things. And the response from the traditional leaders was very, very strong. And they sort of said, for example, as royalty, we will wear leopard skin, not because we hate the animal, but because we have such deep respect for the animal. And that the whole idea that, for example, people can actually trade in this animal or breed them en masse for their skins or for their bones is anathema. It's completely anti the culture. It undermines the culture. And in fact, they find it insulting. So there's a strong cultural element in South Africa already around wildlife trade. But that's not the issue. The issue is about criminal activities, selling it to very, very willing markets. So unless we send emissaries from South African local communities across to Southeast Asia to beg the Southeast Asian people not to have a demand for rhino, I'm afraid your method has no impact whatsoever.
Okay. Can I respond now? Thank you so much,
Of
Peter.
course.
I think you're totally right. When I give this give this discussion, that I was talking really from the perspective of ASEAN, and this is also something why I also highlighted in the beginning of my discussion ASEAN as a whole, precisely because ASEAN countries are both demand side and supply side, and we still have a lot of work to be done when it comes to both demand and supply. I think um, from in the context of South Africa, and this I have a lot of things to learn, and I'm sure from you, from a lot of people in the room. So I don't mean to speak for the context of South Africa, because I think in a certain way, shape or form, cultural law can still impact. And what you mentioned about royalty, for example, wearing leopard skins, that's something great to unpack, but it's not something I could do at this moment, precisely also because my focus, and as you highlighted, would be ASEAN. But maybe in the future, we can sit down and think about it, and like what can this mean in the South African context, of course, giving different examples, giving a totally different view of how things work. So I hope this answers your question, Peter, and thank you so much for highlighting this.
Thank
Okay.
you. Let's give Zunaida an opportunity.
Yes.
Hi, Chad. Thank you so much. It was such a thought-provoking session, and I really enjoyed it. And I think you've highlighted there's so much that needs to be done going forward. And I think drawing from there, I was wondering in what way can wildlife conservation laws be strengthened in to include and to address the actual climate change impacts on wildlife?
Okay. Climate change impacts on wildlife. Zunaida, let me clarify your question. So you want to see how you want to see how wildlife trade laws in particular, or just wildlife laws?
So I'm looking at the actual impact of climate change on wildlife.
Yes.
I And as much as I'm in the climate sphere, that's not something I've considered as yet. We've considered climate change impacts on people, on the
Right.
environment generally, but nothing broadly focused on wildlife. So I'm just
Yes.
wondering, you know, can the laws be strengthened, the general conservation laws, to be, you know, in order to address the impact of climate change on the wildlife, on the rhino or the zebra, or, you know, whichever, including marine wildlife?
Yes.
As
Okay.
I was just going to say, because of ITLOS, you know, it's been broadened now to the marine as the ITLOS advisory opinion sort of broadened the climate change impacts to include pollution on marine life. So just
Yes.
thinking from all of those points. Thank you, Chad.
You're welcome, and I'm happy to see you. I love how we've seen each other in like 3 different countries now. Um, well, technically online this time, but still. In any case, so there are a number of studies on climate change impacts on wildlife, for sure. Not just people. I think in conservation biology, for example, they do a lot of work on this. Um, and so because of that, there are on the sidelines individuals who write for when there was, for example, an open call with the International Criminal Court on whether to include a group or whether to include transnational environmental harms as a crime. um, there are certain groups, including us as a group with colleagues from the Paulus Parks moot on international law and animal rights, who submitted to the court our position paper on how climate change and wildlife biodiversity, how they're all interrelated. And aside from legal action on this, legislative action, we should also have judicial action regarding recognizing both of these two seemingly different fields. So I think for sure that there already are initiatives towards both not legalizing, legislating, and also recognizing in the judicial sphere the impacts of climate change on wildlife and vice versa, and with animals and plants as ecosystem engineers. But also, and as you noted in the beginning of your discussion, much work needs to be done.
Thank you. If I'm not mistaken, there are a few decisions from the Rights of Nature Tribunal that do actually make the link between climate change and biodiversity and animals. So those are very encouraging to look at in this context. Thank you so much. Just quickly, we have a minute. Does anyone else have a question? Otherwise, we can thank Chad and wrap up. All right. No, I don't see a question. Chad, thank you so much for joining us today. It
Thank you,
was really,
Angela.
really good to speak about wildlife. We often have so many climate change related webinars, and it was just good also to bring attention to this very important topic and a contentious topic in the South African context.
I know,
But
I can imagine. Yesterday we had brunch,
oh,
and
well,
yeah, with some other people also from Wageningen, and one of them is South African, and someone also worked in South Africa, and it was such an interesting conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about it from you
yeah,
guys.
it definitely also highlights the need for more research,
Mm.
impactful research in this area. But thank you so much. Chad, it was lovely to host you. Thank you for everyone who was here, who made time on a very busy Monday afternoon. Chad, if you are comfortable, please do share your slides so I can make them available. And this recording will also be made available on our YouTube channel. But thank you so much for joining. Thank you, everyone else. And we actually do have a webinar in October. We will start advertising that soon, but it's on the advisory opinion to the African Court of Human Rights. So again, it's climate change. And then we might have another webinar in November, but we will send out details. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Chad. We'll see you
Thank you,
soon.
Angela. See you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers, folks, and thank you very, very much.